They walked into the house on a crisp morning, keys in hand, hearts full of hope. It was the moment every homeowner dreams of, a fresh start, a new chapter. The smell of fresh paint still lingered in the air, masking the decades of life this house had witnessed. But on that very first night, something happened that neither of them could explain. A sound. Low, steady, deliberate. At first, they laughed it off. "Old houses make noises," they said. But as the hours stretched into dawn, their laughter faded, replaced by the unnerving realization that the sound wasn't random. Days passed, and the signs grew stranger. The family dog refused to enter the living room, its eyes fixed on the same empty corner. Lights flickered, though the wiring had been inspected. And then there were the voices. Soft, muffled whispers that seemed to rise from the walls themselves. At first, they told themselves it was stress, exhaustion, maybe even their imaginations playing tricks. But as the strange events escalated, one question became impossible to ignore. Was this house simply old and creaky? Or was it trying to warn them? By the time they uncovered the truth, it was too late. What they found in the basement would haunt them forever. And now, we're here to tell their story. A story that will make you think twice before turning off the lights tonight. Mark and Rachel had been searching for months. The housing market was relentless, but when their realtor called about the old Victorian on Cedar Lane, it felt like fate. When they pulled into the driveway for the first time, Rachel gasped. The house was even better in person. Towering and proud, its weathered charm hinting at stories from another time. "This is it," Rachel whispered. Mark agreed. They envisioned a life here. Summer barbecues on the porch, Christmas mornings by the fireplace, children's laughter filling the halls. But as they stepped through the front door, a subtle chill cut through the warm summer air. Mark shrugged it off. "Old houses have drafts," he said, brushing past a stained glass window that cast fractured light across the foyer. Rachel's focus was on the staircase, an intricately carved banister winding upward, but the way the shadows danced on it gave her pause. The layout was quirky but endearing. Creaky floorboards that groaned underfoot, a narrow hallway lined with doors that seemed to lean inward ever so slightly, and a kitchen that smelled faintly of earth despite its new appliances. In the attic, they found old trunks stacked in the corner. Rachel laughed, imagining treasure or love letters sealed in those dusty boxes. Still, something about the house felt off. Mark noticed it first. The light switches flicked on and off without reason. Rachel found herself startled by reflections in the old mirrors. Something about the way her image seemed delayed, almost watching her. Then there was the clock in the dining room, an antique fixture that hadn't worked in years according to the realtor. Yet on their first night, at exactly 3:15 a.m., its pendulum began to swing. The couple told themselves it was all part of the charm of owning a house with history. "It's just settling," Mark said, as a faint tapping noise echoed from the walls late one night. But what they didn't know was that the house had been through far more than any inspection report could reveal. What Rachel thought was simply peeling wallpaper was something else entirely. Behind the paper, claw-like scratches covered the walls, as though someone, or something, had been trying desperately to get out. Still, the couple clung to their optimism. But the house had other plans, and the dream they'd built was about to crumble under the weight of its secrets. It started on their second night in the house. Rachel had fallen asleep on the couch while unpacking boxes, a half-empty glass of wine still perched on the coffee table. Mark had gone to bed earlier, exhausted from hauling furniture. Around midnight, Rachel stirred awake, startled by a faint sound. Something tapping, soft and rhythmic, as though someone were knocking gently against the window pane. She glanced at the living room windows. The curtains swayed ever so slightly, though the air was still. She stood, cautiously peering outside, but the street was empty. No breeze, no movement, just the oppressive silence of the neighborhood after dark. She shook her head, blaming her imagination, and went upstairs. The next morning, Mark complained about a cold draft in the bedroom. "I thought we closed all the windows," he said, rubbing his arms. Rachel nodded, though she distinctly remembered hearing the unmistakable click of the latch as she locked them the night before. Still, they chalked it up to old house quirks and moved on. But the small oddities began piling up. The light in the kitchen would flicker at the same time every night, always around 9:30 p.m. Mark blamed it on the wiring. "It's an old house. These things happen," he muttered, though his eyes lingered on the fixture longer than necessary. Rachel started noticing items out of place. A photo frame she swore she left on the mantel was suddenly on the dining room table. A chair from the kitchen was pulled out slightly, as though someone had been sitting there, though neither of them had touched it. She tried to laugh it off, telling herself she must have moved them and forgotten. But deep down, unease had started to creep in. One night, as Rachel folded laundry in the guest bedroom, she heard faint whispers. At first, she thought Mark was on the phone, but the house was silent except for her. The whispers didn't come from any one direction. They seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, just barely audible over the sound of her own breathing. She froze, her heart pounding. After a moment, they stopped. She convinced herself it was the wind, though the windows were firmly shut. Mark's experiences were even stranger. Late one evening, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing in the attic above. Thinking Rachel was up there sorting through the old trunks, he called out to her. When she didn't respond, he climbed the narrow staircase, flashlight in hand. The attic was empty. Dust hung in the air, undisturbed, and the trunks were exactly as they'd left them. But the footsteps continued, steady and deliberate, as though they were walking in circles just inches away from where he stood. He came down shaken, but didn't tell Rachel. Instead, he muttered something about old wood and loose floorboards, though he couldn't ignore the dread clawing at the back of his mind. The dog, Milo, started behaving strangely too. Normally cheerful and energetic, Milo now avoided certain parts of the house altogether, especially the dining room. He would stop at the threshold, staring into the empty space beyond, his fur bristling. On more than one occasion, Rachel found him growling at the corner of the room, his eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. The couple began sleeping with the lights on, though neither admitted why. The tension grew heavier with each passing day, as though the house itself were pressing down on them. And then, one night, Rachel woke to find her glass of water missing from her bedside table. It wasn't in the bathroom, the kitchen, or anywhere else she looked. Hours later, it appeared on the staircase, half empty, the rim coated in condensation, as though someone had been drinking from it. Whatever was happening in the house, it was growing bolder, and no matter how many explanations they tried to convince themselves of, they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The disturbances became impossible to ignore. What began as faint whispers and misplaced objects evolved into something far more unsettling. Doors slammed shut without warning, reverberating through the house like gunshots. At first, Mark thought it was the wind, but every door was securely latched. One night, Rachel was alone in the kitchen washing dishes when the room plunged into darkness. The light flickered violently before cutting out entirely, leaving her standing in silence, the only sound being the water running from the faucet. She fumbled for her phone to use the flashlight, but when the light hit the sink, her heart stopped. There, etched faintly in the steam on the window above, was a single word: leave. She screamed, and Mark came running. When he arrived, the message had already disappeared. Rachel tried to explain, her voice trembling, but Mark could see nothing but her reflection in the window. He told her it was probably condensation patterns, though he avoided looking too closely at the glass himself. The shadows in the house began to change. At first, it was subtle. Rachel would catch movement in the corner of her eye, only to turn and find nothing. But over time, they became more defined, taking on shapes that seemed almost human. One night, as Mark worked late in the basement, he felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. He spun around, flashlight in hand, expecting to see Rachel, or anyone, but the space behind him was empty. Upstairs, Rachel had her own terrifying experience. She was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The faint sound of breathing filled the room, slow and deliberate. At first, she thought it was Mark, but when she turned over, She saw he was fast asleep. The breathing continued, just inches from her ear, sending a wave of icy fear down her spine. She squeezed her eyes shut, too terrified to move, and prayed for morning. The most chilling moment came just days later. The couple decided to host a small dinner party in an effort to distract themselves. A few friends gathered around the dining room table, wine glasses clinking as they laughed and shared stories. But midway through the evening, the chandelier above them began to sway. At first, it was subtle, like a gentle push, but then it swung violently, its chains groaning as if under immense strain. The guests froze, staring upward as the lights flickered, and the room filled with an eerie, low hum. One of their friends, visibly shaken, asked if the house was haunted. Mark laughed nervously, brushing it off as a structural issue. But Rachel couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. She excused herself to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she poured another glass of wine. She glanced at the window above the sink, half expecting to see another message. Instead, her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her face. The expression was twisted, unrecognizable, its eyes dark and hollow. The turning point came later that night when they heard footsteps again, this time coming from the attic. But unlike before, the pacing stopped directly above their bedroom. Mark grabbed a flashlight and climbed the attic stairs once more. The air was suffocatingly still, the kind of silence that feels unnatural. As he scanned the room, his beam landed on a trunk that had been closed the last time they were up there. Now, it sat open, its contents spilled across the floor. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, black and white portraits of people they didn't recognize, their faces solemn, their eyes staring directly into the camera. But one photo stood out. It was a picture of their bedroom. The same furniture, the same layout, except the bed was unmade, and in the corner of the frame stood a figure Mark had never seen before. He stumbled backward, the photo slipping from his hands. The attic door slammed shut behind him with such force that the entire house seemed to shudder. He screamed for Rachel, but by the time he made it downstairs, his voice was shaking. Rachel knew, without him having to explain, that they couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. Whatever was in the house didn't want them there, and it was becoming clear that it wasn't going to let them leave. Rachel was the first to suggest it. They needed to know more about the house. What had happened here? Why did everything feel so wrong? Mark resisted at first, reluctant to admit there might be something more than creaking floorboards and faulty wiring. But after the attic incident, he couldn't deny it any longer. They began their search online. At first, it was just the basics: property records, old real estate listings. The house had been built in the late 1800s and passed through several owners, many of whom seemed to stay only briefly before selling. But there was one detail that caught Rachel's attention. In the 1940s, the property had been vacant for nearly 2 decades. No records of occupants, no sale transactions, just a long, empty gap. Digging deeper, they stumbled across an article in an archived local newspaper. The headline was small, buried in the back pages: "Family vanishes without a trace. Police baffled." Rachel clicked on it, her heart pounding. The article described the disappearance of the Turner family, who had lived in the house during the late 1920s. One evening, neighbors reported hearing screams coming from the property, but by the time authorities arrived, the house was silent. Inside, they found the table set for dinner, food still warm on the plates. The front door was unlocked, and all the family's belongings were untouched, but the Turners were never seen again. Rachel shared the discovery with Mark, who grew pale. "That doesn't mean anything," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. But Rachel wasn't finished. She had found more, a series of strange incidents that followed in the years after the Turners' disappearance. In the 1950s, a single man moved into the house, only to be found dead 6 months later. The cause? Starvation. Neighbors claimed he had become a recluse, refusing to leave the house or let anyone inside. In the 1970s, a young couple purchased the property, but the wife left suddenly after just 3 weeks, filing for divorce and citing unbearable experiences as her reason. The more they uncovered, the darker the picture became.
they found a photograph of the house from 1910, its exterior nearly unchanged. But there was something eerie about the photo. In one of the windows, a second-story bedroom, stood a shadowy figure. At first, they thought it was just a trick of the light, but the figure's outline was too clear, its presence too deliberate.
Desperate for answers, they decided to visit the town archives. Rachel combed through property records and police reports, while Mark looked through microfilm of old newspapers. Finally, Rachel found it, an unmarked folder tucked in the back of a filing cabinet. Inside were handwritten notes from a local historian who had been researching the house in the 1980s. The historian's notes revealed something neither of them expected. The house had been built on the site of an older structure, a boarding school that had burned down in 1876. The fire killed nearly 24 people, including several children. Survivors claimed the fire started in the basement, where one of the teachers had been performing rituals. Though the details were vague, the notes hinted at something far more disturbing, a suggestion that the teacher had been attempting to contact something from beyond. Mark's hands trembled as he read aloud. The survivors reported strange occurrences in the days leading up to the fire. Scratching sounds in the walls, voices that didn't belong to anyone living. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. Everything they had experienced, the whispers, the shadows, the slamming doors, it all matched. But there was one last piece of the puzzle, something that sent their fears spiraling into terror. At the bottom of the historian's notes was a single ominous warning, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Those who disturb this house awaken what lies beneath. Once awakened, it does not rest. They looked at each other, their breath shallow. For the first time, they truly understood. Whatever was in their home wasn't just haunting them, it was warning them. And ignoring those warnings had awakened something they couldn't hope to control. Mark and Rachel's unease had turned to desperation. The warnings they uncovered about the house were no longer abstract history, they were living through them. The atmosphere in the house had shifted. It felt oppressive, suffocating, as though the air itself resisted their presence. They knew they couldn't continue like this. Something had to be done. Rachel, trembling but determined, reached out to a local paranormal investigator she found online. His name was Daniel Hayes, a man who specialized in cases of extreme hauntings. His website featured testimonials from families who claimed he had saved their homes, and in some cases their lives. Mark was skeptical, but Rachel insisted they needed professional help. Daniel arrived 2 days later, carrying an array of strange equipment: EMF detectors, thermal cameras, and bundles of herbs Mark couldn't identify. The moment he stepped inside, Daniel froze, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. "This place has energy," he said, his voice low. "Heavy energy." He began his investigation that night, setting up cameras in the attic, basement, and main living areas. He asked Mark and Rachel to sit with him in the dining room while he conducted an EVP session. Holding a small recorder, Daniel began asking questions. "Is there anyone here with us? Can you give us a sign of your presence?" For several minutes, there was silence. Then, faintly, the recorder crackled to life. The voice was faint but unmistakable, a deep, guttural whisper. "Leave." Rachel's face went pale, and Mark gripped the edge of the table. Daniel's expression darkened. "It's intelligent," he said, "and it doesn't want you here." The following night, Daniel performed a cleansing ritual. He walked through the house, burning sage and chanting in a language Mark and Rachel didn't recognize. At first, the ritual seemed to help. The oppressive atmosphere lightened, and for the first time in weeks, the couple slept peacefully. But their relief was short-lived. 3 nights later, the house retaliated. Mark and Rachel were woken at 3:15 a.m. by a loud, violent crash. They rushed into the hallway to find the chandelier in the dining room shattered on the floor, its chain twisted as though it had been ripped down by an unseen force. The air was freezing, and the faint smell of smoke hung in the air, though there was no fire. As they stood in shock, a low growl echoed from the staircase. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was something else entirely. The growl grew louder, closer. And then the lights in the house flickered wildly before plunging them into darkness. Rachel screamed as a shadow moved through the hallway, impossibly tall and unnaturally fast. It passed through the walls as though the house itself was alive. Mark grabbed Rachel's hand and pulled her outside, both of them gasping for air as they collapsed on the lawn. Daniel arrived moments later, drawn by their frantic phone call. "It's stronger than I thought," he admitted grimly, but the worst was yet to come. Determined to confront whatever was tormenting them, Daniel returned to the house alone the next evening. He set up his equipment in the attic, where he believed the entity's presence was strongest. Mark and Rachel waited outside, too terrified to step back inside. An hour passed, then two. When Daniel finally emerged, his face was pale, his hands trembling. "You need to leave," he said, his voice hollow. "Whatever is here, it isn't just a spirit. It's something much older, much darker." Rachel's voice cracked as she asked the question she was dreading. "Can we stop it?" Daniel hesitated. "Maybe, but not without a cost." That night, the couple packed their bags and checked into a motel. But even as they locked the door behind them, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. Whatever had awakened in the house wasn't bound by walls, and it wasn't finished with them yet. Mark and Rachel couldn't bring themselves to return to the house, but the haunting seemed unwilling to let them go. Even at the motel, the oppressive dread lingered. Rachel woke several times during the night, her heart pounding as if she'd been startled awake by a sound she couldn't remember. Mark assured her it was stress, but he felt it too, a strange, gnawing sense that they were being watched. On the third night at the motel, it happened. Rachel woke to the sound of static. Groggy, she sat up and realized it was coming from the television. The screen glowed faintly in the dark room, showing nothing but snow. Mark groaned and reached for the remote to turn it off, but the static grew louder. And then it stopped. A chilling silence filled the room, broken only by a faint tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the door. Rachel froze, staring at the handle. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, each knock sending a wave of cold fear through her chest. "Who's there?" Mark called, his voice shaking. No answer. He got up slowly, stepping toward the door as Rachel whispered, "Don't open it." The tapping stopped, but as Mark peered through the peephole, his blood ran cold. There was no one there. He exhaled shakily, turning back to Rachel. "There's nothing." Before he could finish, the tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't at the door. It was at the window. Rachel screamed as the curtains billowed outward, though the window was shut tight. A shadowy figure loomed outside, its form impossibly distorted, its face obscured. Mark grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the bathroom, slamming the door behind them. The light flickered violently, and the air turned icy. Rachel clung to Mark, sobbing as a low, guttural growl reverberated through the walls. The growl grew louder, more guttural, until it felt like the room itself was trembling under its weight. And then came the voice. A chilling whisper, low and guttural, filled the small bathroom. It spoke no words they could understand, but the malice in its tone was unmistakable. It circled them, the sound moving from one corner of the room to the next, as if taunting them. Mark shouted into the darkness, his voice desperate. "What do you want?" The whisper stopped, replaced by silence so profound it was deafening. And then, scrawled across the bathroom mirror in streaks of condensation, a single word appeared. "You." The mirror shattered. Glass sprayed across the room as the lights went out completely. Mark shielded Rachel with his body, both of them bracing for whatever would come next. But the room fell silent again. They remained huddled in the dark for what felt like hours, the only sound their ragged breathing. When they finally summoned the courage to leave the bathroom, the motel room was destroyed. Furniture was overturned, their belongings were scattered across the floor, and the word "leave" was etched into the walls, over and over, in jagged scratches. Mark and Rachel didn't wait for morning. They fled the motel that night, driving aimlessly until dawn broke. But no matter how far they went, they couldn't escape the feeling that they were being followed. Because deep down, they knew the truth. The entity wasn't bound to the house. It had attached itself to them. And now, wherever they went, it would follow. Mark and Rachel spent the following days in a blur of fear and exhaustion. Every attempt to find peace was met with failure. The entity's presence was inescapable, an oppressive shadow that lingered no matter where they went. Desperate, they turned to Daniel again. He reluctantly agreed to meet them at a church just outside town, warning them that whatever had attached itself to them was unlike anything he'd encountered before. He brought with him a priest, Father Michael, who specialized in exorcisms and cleansing rituals. Father Michael listened intently as they recounted their experiences, his expression growing graver with every detail. "This is no ordinary spirit," he said quietly. "It is bound to you now, feeding off your fear. If we are to sever the connection, it will take great strength and a willingness to confront it." The ritual was set for midnight. The church was dimly lit, the faint glow of candles casting long shadows across the stone walls. Mark and Rachel sat in the center of the room as Father Michael began the exorcism, his voice steady and commanding. At first, the air was still, the only sound the priest's Latin incantations. But as the ritual continued, the temperature plummeted. Frost formed on the windows and the candles flickered violently. A deep, guttural growl filled the room, shaking the very ground beneath them. Rachel screamed as a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its form writhing and shifting as though it were made of smoke. Mark held her tightly, his eyes wide with terror as the entity moved closer, its hollow gaze fixed on them. Father Michael raised a crucifix, his voice unwavering as he commanded the entity to leave. The figure recoiled, but it did not retreat. Instead, it lunged toward Mark, its presence overwhelming and suffocating. He gasped, his body convulsing as a searing pain tore through him. Rachel's cries echoed through the church as she clung to him, her tears falling onto his pale face. "Fight it, Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't let it take you." Summoning every ounce of strength, Mark gritted his teeth and shouted into the darkness, "You don't own me! You don't control us!" The shadow faltered, its form flickering like a dying flame. Father Michael pressed forward, his voice rising in intensity as he delivered the final prayer. With a deafening roar, the entity dissipated, its presence vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. For a moment, the church was silent. The air grew warm again, the frost on the windows melting into rivulets. Mark collapsed into Rachel's arms, both of them trembling but alive. Father Michael placed a hand on their shoulders, his face weary but resolute. "It's over," he said. "You're free." But as the couple left the church that night, the shadows seemed to stretch a little too long beneath the streetlights. And when Rachel glanced into the rearview mirror as they drove away, she thought she saw a figure standing in the church doorway, watching them. Mark noticed her unease. "What's wrong?" he asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Weeks later, they sold the house and moved to a new town, determined to start over. But strange things began happening again. Objects moved, lights flickered, and one night, as Rachel lay in bed, she woke to a familiar sound, a faint tapping, steady and deliberate, coming from the window. Her breath caught as she turned toward the sound. This time, she didn't dare look. The screen fades to black as the tapping grows louder, ending with one final deafening knock. As the couple's story comes to an end, or perhaps just begins, one question remains. Would you have stayed in that house? Could you endure the constant terror, the shadows that watch, and the whispers that call your name in the dead of night? We want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in Mark and Rachel's shoes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story sent chills down your spine, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps more people discover these haunting tales. For more spine-tingling stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss an update.